All right, guys, welcome back to the Unprofessional Kitchen, where I show you how to make great food in the average kitchen. And today we're making one of the greatest date meals of all time, the steak dinner. Now, this is something that I think a lot of people tend to avoid trying to make at home because they're always worried they're going to mess it up. But I'm going to show you step by step all the things you can do to make sure that you make the best steak dinner you've ever had in your life. So let's not waste any more time and get straight to cooking. So for the cut of meat, I'm going to be using a ribeye. I'm using bone in, but you can use bone out if that's what you prefer. I'm using a ribeye because in a world where everybody and their grandmother seems to be cooking with $500 A5 Wagyu steaks online, ribeye is a really good in-between of something that you can get for relatively affordable, but it's very versatile with a decent marbling profile and honestly just tastes delicious. So before we actually get started on prepping and cooking, I want to go over a couple of pointers to follow that I think is really going to make this process a lot easier for everyone. So first and foremost, when it comes to degree of doneness, there's a number of ways you can go about doing it. When we were working in the restaurant, the way that they used to teach us is through this weird finger method where you would pinch your fingers together, and then depending on how tight the muscle under your thumb was, that was degree of doneness. So if you were like this with your index, that would be the texture for rare. If you were like this with your middle finger, that would be medium rare, and so on and so forth. The problem with this method is it only really works if you've cooked like 1,000 steaks in your life and you have a really good sense for what you're feeling relative to like how long the steak's been over the heat. So what I recommend and what I've been doing is just to get an instant read thermometer. Now you can go with several options. Over here we have a Bluetooth option. This is phenomenal. You can put it in the meat and then you put it in the stove and it reads directly to your phone based on the conditions and the temperature you're trying to reach. But this can be pretty pricey, and honestly, it's not a necessity. And you can go out and buy one of these. It's like $14 or $15 and it works just as well. And we're actually going to use it as a reference point to make sure that our steaks are done correctly. Another important note is a lot of people tend to be scared to cook with large cuts of meat in the sense of thickness. I would actually argue that when you're looking for a steak, you want to make sure to get something that's at least 1.25 inches to 1.5 inches thick. And the reason why is because thicker cuts of meat are far more forgiving when it comes to the cooking process. Thin cuts of meat are very difficult to hit a specific internal temperature because they cook so quickly. With a thicker cut of meat, because it takes a lot longer, you have a lot more bandwidth to make sure that you get it correct. All right, so our first step, and a very important one, is to season both sides of the steak generously with kosher salt. Steak at this size is pretty difficult to oversalt, so don't be afraid to be a little heavy-handed with it. Once done, leave it on the side and let it rest at room temperature for 20 to 30 minutes. While we wait for the steak to reach room temperature, we're just going to do a quick prep for the sauce that we're going to be serving with it. Start by finely mincing 3 cloves of garlic and finely dicing 1 shallot, which is done using the same technique you would to cut an onion. If you don't know how to do that, you can go watch my first video where I explain how. Lastly, we're going to cut and set aside about 3 tablespoons of cold unsalted butter. Now for cooking the steak, I'm going to be using about 3 tablespoons of beef tallow, which if you can't find, you can substitute for canola oil or anything with a really high smoke point. In addition, we will be using about 4 to 5 cloves of garlic, a couple of sprigs of thyme, and about 4 or 5 tablespoons of unsalted butter. If you look at our steaks now, the salt has completely penetrated and been absorbed by the meat and drawn out all the moisture, which we're going to remove with a paper towel. At this point, if you have one, we're going to insert the Bluetooth thermometer into the center of one of our steaks. And if you don't have one, that's fine, because as I mentioned, I'm going to use the handheld thermometer as a second point of reference later on. Place the steak onto the wire rack over a baking sheet and place that into the oven at 250 degrees Fahrenheit for 15 to 20 minutes, or until the internal temperature hits 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Once we remove it, I'll check with the second thermometer, and as you can see, the second steak without the Bluetooth thermometer is reading only a couple degrees off from 100, which is perfect because they're going to rest for a few minutes to cover that last stretch. So a little bit of a disclaimer here, we actually had a technical mishap when shooting whereby our battery died midway through cooking the steak, which means we couldn't actually get the last about 10-15% of the video, which means I had to actually reshoot this video on a separate day, which is today. That'll explain why the steaks you see moving forward are not exactly the same as the ones I've introduced at the beginning of the video. They're still both ribeyes, it's just one of them doesn't have the bone in, and the one that I introduced at the beginning is a bone in ribeye. But all of the steps, tips, procedures, ingredients that I've introduced up until this point were all applied exactly the same to the second pair as the first pair. Next, we're going to place our stainless steel pan on a medium-high heat, and the trick to tell if it's hot enough is to splash some water in it, and if it beads like this, that means your pan is hot enough, at which point we're going to add the beef tallow. Let that melt and cover the entire surface area of the pan. You see how we're getting that intense smoke coming off? That's exactly what we want. We need this really hot so we can get a great sear. Lay your steaks down and just give them a good press to ensure good contact with the pan. Leave them like this untouched for max 3 minutes on this face. Then flip it onto the side to sear the fat cap and flip it to the other face. As you can see, we got a beautiful sear that's going to add a ton of flavor. Once we flip them, we're now going to add in our butter, garlic, and thyme. As the butter melts, tilt the pan towards you so it pools on the pan. With a spoon, start basting that butter on your steaks. As you do this, the garlic and the herbs will infuse into the butter. Basting it constantly will help distribute that flavor onto your steak as well as help cook them more evenly. Continue to do this for about 3 minutes. Then with your thermometer, check the internal temperature. Take the steaks off when they've hit the internal temperature of 125 to max 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Set aside to rest for 5 to 10 minutes. You can see here in the pan we've developed what's called a fond from the seared meat. This is loaded with flavor and what we're going to use to help build on our steak sauce. Start by deglazing the pan with a 1/4 cup of brandy. Optionally flambe it if you like to set things on fire. Safely, of course. Scrap off those delicious bits with a wooden spoon to help merge that flavor with the deglazing liquid. Next, add 1 cup of dry red wine and mix that in. And then leave it on the heat until it gets to a hard simmer, at which point you can now add your shallots and garlic. As it reduces, you'll see it loses some of that liquid content and starts concentrating the wine flavors. Keep this going for about 10 minutes or so before adding 1.5 cups of homemade beef stock. Check out episode 8 if you're interested in seeing how to make this. Mix that in to continue to reduce, and as you do, season with fresh cracked black pepper and salt to taste. Now at this point, I was supposed to finish by cutting the heat and adding 3 to 4 tablespoons of cold unsalted butter to emulsify the sauce and give it its velvety texture. But in the chaos of shooting, I completely forgot, so make sure you do this. If you don't, your sauce will still taste good, but it will likely have an overly liquid consistency like this. For the moment of truth, we cut our steak and see that our efforts have produced a perfectly pink medium rare. One of the signs that you've done a great job is to look for minimal gray banding around the cross section, because this is a sign that steak has cooked evenly throughout. Now I'm just going to slice it up for serving. If you cut into the steak without resting it, you'll lose a lot of the juices to the cutting board, so please don't skip that step. Now I'm just going to plate this steak with a side of pan-seared rapini and top it off with the red wine sauce to enjoy. I'm well aware the presentation looks like dog shit, but remember, I'm not a professional. Alright guys, that sums up my video on how to make a high quality amazing steak at home. I really hope that this video has convinced you that you can cook a restaurant quality steak with ordinary kitchen resources as long as you follow the simple steps and guides that I've outlined in this video. If you like this video and you want to see more, please give me a thumbs up and think about subscribing to the YouTube channel. And if there's anything that you want to see me cook in the average kitchen, leave it in the comment section below and I'll be happy to do it. Until then, thanks for watching and I'll see you guys next time.